Now, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, meets for a summit this Sunday. It's 3 members down, with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger calling their decision to leave the bloc, quote, irreversible. They've launched their own regional bloc, the Alliance of Sahel States, after breaking with France and pivoting towards Russia diplomatically. Their departure could affect the free movement of people and goods in the region. And to talk more about it, we're joined by Paul Melly. He's consulting fellow of the Africa Programme at Chatham House in London. Thanks for speaking to France 24.
Good morning.
So these 3 breakaway countries, they almost seem to take a bit of a step to reassure maybe on Saturday, saying that people from ECOWAS countries would still enjoy free movement on their territory. Are they perhaps realising what they've got to lose?
Yes, because what really motivated their decision to break away was essentially politics. The fact that after the military coups in those 3 Sahel countries, ECOWAS was setting tough conditions in line with its governance protocol demanding the restoration of civilian elected constitutional rule. And these military governments did not want to comply, at least not in the time frame that ECOWAS was suggesting. So it's that political factor which has led them to decide to pull out of the ECOWAS bloc. It's not an economic decision. And so with this proposal to maintain the free movement, because ECOWAS has a sort of, just like the Schengen zone in Europe, a free movement for its citizens who can live and work in whichever member country they like. In a sense, the Sahel states are trying to extend an olive branch and say, we want to pull out politically, but we're not really seeking to affect the structures of West African economic integration. ECOWAS is a customs union. It has the free movement rules, of course, and it has a whole network of cooperative arrangements on all sorts of everyday practical arrangements, even if it hasn't quite reached a sort of European-style single market. And at the very human level, borders in West Africa are very porous, very informal. Huge numbers of people move back and forth all the time. They have family on both sides of the borders. There are, for example, millions, possibly as many as 3 million or even more, Burkinabe citizens resident in Côte d'Ivoire, where they're very heavily involved, particularly in the cocoa sector. So the Sahel states have made this gesture. Whether the ECOWAS leaders will decide to reciprocate immediately, or perhaps only on a provisional basis, or whether they decide to have some sort of discussion about the details of transition and how far there will be a sort of separation or a breakup of the links, remains to be seen. And then overlying all this, the 3 Sahel states are also members of the CFA franc, which is not an ECOWAS currency, but is nevertheless a currency used by 8 countries in West Africa, and all the other 5 members of that monetary bloc are in ECOWAS and are remaining.
So if I understand you correctly, it's not maybe about trying to bring these countries back into ECOWAS this summer, as much as that might be what's being said at a surface level, but it's kind of trying to maintain as many economic ties as possible, even if there's a rebranding, if you describe it that way, of the Sahel states and their alliance?
I think that's a good way of capturing it. At the last summit, main heads of state summit of ECOWAS in July, the president of Senegal, the new president, President Faye, who's a very charismatic figure with a lot of youth appeal, seen as quite radical. And for that reason, he was chosen as the ECOWAS mediator, the ECOWAS envoy, if you like, to the Sahel states to try and persuade them to stay. But although he and the president of Togo are going to give a briefing on their mediation efforts, no one is expecting them to announce that some sort of deal on keeping the Sahel states in the bloc has been reached. So probably for ECOWAS, the key challenge is to limit the damage. If if they can maintain, if they can, as it were, limit this to being a political phenomenon, and in the hope that in the long term, the Sahel states will be persuaded to rejoin, because ECOWAS, the economic power in ECOWAS is in the coastal countries, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Senegal, and so on, and who are remaining in the bloc. And so the question is, can ECOWAS, because of the momentum of its economies, of its growth, and although global perceptions of West Africa are often unfavorable, in fact, it's worth remembering that the region has maintained pretty strong economic growth for a couple of decades now, and was barely touched by the COVID pandemic, for example, compared with Europe. If they can maintain that economic attractiveness, they will hope that in the long term, the Sahel states will rejoin. And there is a political dimension, which is that if they were to stay in the bloc, or say that they wanted to quickly come back in immediately, while they're still under military governments who took powers through coups, that in some ways would pose a challenge for ECOWAS political credibility, because one of the strengths of the bloc has been the fact that it has had political rules, governance rules about elections, about democratic accountability, about constitutional rule. And although those have sometimes been breached, and there are some countries that certainly don't live up to those standards, broadly ECOWAS has defended, if you like, that political agenda to a much greater extent than any other regional bloc in Africa. So in some ways, a situation where the Sahel states leave in political terms, but most of the practical, economic, technical, and social arrangements continue, and wherefore ordinary West Africans, everyday life, moving back across the borders, trading fairly freely, etc., continues as if nothing had happened. That may be the best interim solution for now.
If ECOWAS wants these countries obviously to remain closely linked, they also have to presumably take on the chin all of this criticism and rhetoric coming from those countries that say ECOWAS is basically a vassal of former colonial leader France because of the shared CFA franc currency. Is ECOWAS just sort of expected to roll with the punches on this one, or can it actually kind of, actually reduce the pressure coming from these countries in some way?
I think a key, certainly they can, and they may look to the example of the European Union, which after all was very heavily criticized by many citizens, and obviously saw one country, the UK, pull out, but which nevertheless has, as it were, maintained its strength and remains sort of fundamental. And that's an example they might look to. But also there are key internal reforms, political reforms, that ECOWAS could contemplate. There are efforts by officials in the ECOWAS Commission, for example, to tighten up the terms of the governance protocol, because one of the criticisms that has often been made of ECOWAS, while the claim that it's controlled by France is really completely implausible, there is a criticism which is made not just in the Sahel, but made by many people in the other countries, particularly younger people, saying it's a club of incumbent presidents, and very often tolerates constitutional manipulations, for example, to get rid of term limits to allow incumbent head of states to seek extra terms in office, and that while, as it were, the governance protocol has protected ECOWAS against some of the worst human rights abuses that we've seen in some other countries in the continent, outside West Africa, there are still many flaws in governance. There are many weaknesses in those governance and democratic and rights structures. And one way that ECOWAS could reconnect, not so much with the population as a whole, but particularly with the opinion formers in West Africa's cities and among the younger population and on social media and so on, is if there is clear action to tighten up those rules on governance. One of the reasons why President Faye in Senegal has been such a powerful example is because Senegal held a clean presidential election. When the former head of state wanted to delay the election, the Constitutional Council prevented him from doing that. The election went ahead. He had to leave. His chosen successor candidate was defeated and accepted the result. So that was an example of democracy working. And we've now seen it just last weekend in Ghana with another election where the incumbent vice president admitted that his hopes for the succession, his hopes of succeeding President Akufo-Addo, he basically conceded defeat even before any of the results had come out. So it's in strengthening those governance and democratic structures that ECOWAS may bolster its own credibility.
Fascinating. Paul Melly, Consulting Fellow of the Africa Programme at Chatham House. Thank you very much for speaking to us.